Look, I know you guys have heard all the stories about China coming together with Russia and with the other countries and devaluing the dollar and people kind of colluding against the U.S. to weaken the U.S. Well, just like last week, I had to remind a couple people who the U.S. is. I want to remind some folk from an economic standpoint from who the U.S. is.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about the armed services last week in terms of the powers that the U.S. has and what really backs currencies. What I want to talk about trade today.
Okay.
And I want to talk about who we trade with, the percentage of imports and exports, who our biggest trading partners are, and why that's important when we hear about these potential international conflicts.
Look, everyone won't be wealthy, but everyone can be basically wealthy.
But let's start with a few statistics. You know, I always look up my statistics. And, got to have some statistics. And let's bring up a few just to give you guys an idea. And I hope for anyone that's listening, you pay attention to this because this is information that we should be not only taught in school, this should be something that we just know on a regular basis. And I find too frequently, we don't know this type of information. So to start things, the top U.S. trading partners in total trades, that's imports and exports, is number one, Mexico, at 15.2%.
Okay.
Number two, Canada at 14.7%.
All right.
And then number three, China, 12.2%. Now, this all makes sense when you think about it, because who should we trade with most? The other regions of this North American continent that we're connected to. It's the simplest way to trade. We don't have to go over oceans to trade. We don't have to put everything in planes. We can go by ground, we can go by air, but our biggest trading partners are literally the ones that are connected to us. So while people think that, yes, we do a lot of trade with China, understand that no, we do the most trade with Mexico and Canada. That puts that wall into a whole nother, never mind. Anyway, when it comes to exports, most of our exports, 16.5% go to Canada, 16.3% go to Mexico, and 13.5% go to China.
Okay.
When it comes to imports now, China does top our import list, 15%, meaning they have the highest percentage of all imports at 15%, but Mexico is 14.5%.
Okay.
And Canada is 13.5%. So most people wouldn't know that we trade almost as much in terms of importing from China as much as we do from Mexico. And when you count the North American continent, obviously we get more imports from Canada and Mexico combined than China. So that's something to keep in mind about our imports and exports. When it comes to what we're importing from China, let's get into that and exporting. We import electrical equipment and machinery, mostly cell phones. Okay, if y'all didn't know, most of our smartphones and such come from China. And what we export to China mostly are oil seeds, fruits, grains, and also electrical equipment. So we give them food. And I'll get back to why that's important later. Mexico, the top import from Mexico is vehicles. We actually get, this was said during the campaign, we don't make cars in Detroit no more. It's funny, but we actually do get most of our vehicles from Mexico. They make them in Mexico. They can make it up to our standards, but they're made from Mexico. And then on top of that, we also get a lot of electrical equipment, machinery from Mexico. When it comes to China, Canada, we import a lot of mineral fuels and oils and vehicles from Canada. And then we give them a lot of machines and vehicles in exchange. So it's a lot of vehicle exchanges, different types of vehicles from big trucks. We export a lot of big trucks. They bring in a lot more small vehicles for us in terms of trade. Also, with the U.S., we are, when it comes to the world, we have the most coal reserve in the entire world. More than China. China's number two, but we actually have more coal than anyone else. Coal is a big time producer of energy, especially to third world countries, which we export on a regular basis to places like China, to India and other countries that are out there. China exports and produces the most steel. Okay, but this is why this is important. If you know what steel is, steel, of course, makes your buildings and everything else. You can't make steel without iron and iron ore. And when it comes to who has the most iron ore in the world, it's actually Australia. Australia has more iron ore than China, Brazil, and Russia combined.
Wow.
Okay, they by far have the most iron in the world. In fact, they send about, I believe, in dollars, roughly $5 to $6 billion of iron ore to China each year. So what that means is when it comes to partnerships, it's not just about a direct partnership like, okay, well, Australia and China have to have a great relationship. Well, Australia is one of the biggest allies to the United States and Europe. So you can't have your steel, which makes you money, which you send out to the world to bring back money for your people, if you don't have a great relationship with Australia. And if you don't have a great relationship with the US and Europe, that puts in jeopardy your relationship with Australia. It's all tied together. So what I'm saying here, what's coming together is to let you know we are so intertwined when it comes to trade, not just with China directly, not just with other countries directly, but through relationships as an international community, that these things are not going to be put at risk, because if this falls down and breaks down, China doesn't have enough resources to feed its own people. China has almost 2 billion people. They don't have enough resources, which is why they reach out to Africa, which is why they reach out to third world countries and other places, because this is what China does produce very well. Cheap goods. Cheap goods sell well in third world countries. All of this is to be said to remember this, guys. Number one, we shouldn't panic when we see news headlines about international conflicts and about people colluding to weaken the U.S. When it comes down to it, we're so intertwined in trade that these economies can't exist without our trade. Just to throw this last stat out there, when it comes to China, we are literally their biggest buyer. The United States of America is China's biggest customer.
Wow.
So China doesn't necessarily want to be in a negative relationship with us, and they're our third biggest importer. So obviously, we don't want to have a negative relationship with them. It always works out over money. So don't panic, don't go too far. But this is the biggest lesson you can take from the big boys, okay, from the big governments. We should also have this same level of infrastructure in our lives on our level. Who is your China? Who is your Australia? Who's your Mexico? Who's your Canada? Somebody in your circle, people in your circle should be bringing resources to you to trade, and you should be exporting a good too, but you have to figure out what's your best export. Is it just labor? Is it just that you can give hours to do a job, or do you provide more of a resource? Because what happens is when you have these little conflicts, when you have business relationships, when you have a lot of importing and exporting, it prevents real conflict from turning into war, from turning into things that turn into violence. It keeps things peaceful. So when you want to keep your life peaceful from an economic standpoint, have good trading partners, not just people who talk. Not just people who say, you know, I want to take from you, people who also deliver, and make sure you deliver something more than just labor. So that's the lesson of the day, y'all. I wanted to talk a little bit of international economics. I hope that helped you guys out understand who the U.S. is and how we trade. You should know this because this is your country. This is where you live. You helped to build it. It was built on the back of your sweat. You should know what we export. And in fact, just to let you know, when it comes to that coal, the Baltimore, Maryland, just being very specific, is the number 2 the number 2 port in the United States, period, for exporting coal. Okay, number 1 was actually out of Virginia. But number 2 is right here in Baltimore, Maryland. See, just knowing where you live, knowing what we putting out and what we exporting and importing is important. And I ain't talking about something illegal. I'm talking about legal. I did talk a lot of import and export. It sounded like an episode of, one of our favorite shows, BMF or something. Nah, this is not BMF talk. This is real talk. So remember that, guys. Take that to heart because it's important for us to know what we should be doing, but it's also important to know that you should be an import and export, and you should be trading within your own community to build your own strength.
Okay.
All right.
So basically, Uncle Joe,
Yeah.
you're kind of reassuring people like all the talk about them trying to destroy the dollar is much to do about nothing.
Yeah.
Is that safe to say?
Yeah, because you can't destroy it. They depend on the dollar. That's what people don't understand how much we truly depend on each other. Yeah, it does weaken it some. But I said the bigger picture is that we all going to digital dollars or digital money anyway. So it's not as big of a deal. And these type of moves have happened in the past. This is not the first time other countries have left using the dollar for some resource or good and then come back. It's all a game. It's all a cycle. It's not a big deal.